The last region that we need to discuss is the southern colonies. Key terms include indentured servant, middle passage, cash crop, and overseer. Let's start with Maryland. Maryland was created in 1632 as a proprietary colony by a group of Catholics. They had been exiled from England and came to America to start over again, basically. People in Maryland were very concerned about not surviving, especially their first few years. So they required all the settlers to plant both tobacco, a cash crop, and 2 acres of corn. Many also planted additional food sources: wheat, vegetables, fruit, and livestock, grew livestock. To bring settlers to Maryland, they encouraged large numbers of people to come by giving land. For instance, 100 acres of land was given to each male settler, 100 acres for his wife, and 50 acres per child. Larger plantations start to appear because larger amounts of land are being given out. Large plantations means a need for cheap labor. Now, if you were a plantation owner, you also got 100 acres for every servant you brought over. So that greatly increases the plantation size. To begin, there were indentured servants, people who agreed to work without pay to get to America. These were people too poor to leave England themselves, so they would volunteer to work for someone to get a boat ticket over here. Most of these deals consisted of the person, the indentured servant, working for about 7 years without pay. At the end of that 7 years, they were able to leave the plantation and go where they wanted to. It was a pretty good deal at the time. However, the number of people wanting to be indentured servants slowly declines, and we see an increase in African slaves after the decline of indentured servants. Virginia, we're not going to talk about for very long because we talked about Virginia in the beginning. A few key ideas to remember: Jamestown, John Rolfe, and tobacco. The Carolinas. Notice that the Carolinas are one piece initially. We're going to talk about why they split. They were created by charters in 1663 and 65, named Charles's Land in Latin, so it was named after King Charles of England. By 1719, the settlers of Carolina had seized control of the colony from the proprietors, and it did not take long, a little less than 10 years, for the decision to be made to split into North and South Carolina due to major differences. So North Carolina was mostly farmers with smaller plantations. The land was a little bit more difficult, a little rockier than in the South, so there was little need for slaves or indentured servants. Mostly the families could do it on their own. They did grow tobacco and sold forest products, but remember, the overall size of the plantation is much smaller. There was no good harbor in North Carolina, so they were forced to take their goods into Virginia to ship it out of Virginia, mostly Williamsburg. South Carolina. South Carolina had fertile farmland, so they had much larger plantations than what was found in North Carolina. They also had an excellent harbor in the town of Charleston. They didn't need to be dependent on Georgia or Virginia to ship out of. Instead, they had their own harbor. Now, in the 1740s, a woman by the name of Eliza Young finds a blue flower called indigo. It's a blue flowering plant that was used to dye textiles, cloth. Prior to indigo, you could not find blue clothing because no one had the ability to create blue dye. So this was an important industry for South Carolina. Sugar would also be an important industry for South Carolina. Many of their settlers had come from the Barbados, and in the Barbados, they used African slaves to grow sugar. So naturally, when those slave owners and those settlers from the Barbados moved into South Carolina, they brought their slaves with them. So a much larger slave population in South Carolina than North Carolina. We can already see the division between North and South at this point. Now the final colony is Georgia, established in 1733 as a proprietary colony. It was created for English debtors and for the poor, people that didn't have any money. It was hoped that they would be productive in America. The proprietors believed that they needed to create numerous laws to control these people. They banned slavery so that these people had to actually work on their own. They couldn't get a hold of slaves and sit around doing nothing. They also banned Catholicism, which is not shocking since it was an English colony. They banned rum, and they also forced the size of the farms to remain small. Now, most of the settlers objected to these laws, and by 1751, they had overthrown their proprietors, and Georgia becomes a royal colony. Many of these laws and rules begin to change once that occurs. There is one more presentation about the economics of the southern colonies that you will need to take, and at the end of that is the final quiz.